Hello. This is a course given at the Glasgow Living Theology course in June 2020. It's entitled The Last Supper Today. I'm Father Michael Smith. I'm a Jesuit priest. I live and work in London with refugees, and I give courses like this one in theology. It's very appropriate that we should be studying the Last Supper today, this year, the year of the Bible. So much of the history and tradition which led up to the Last Supper is recorded in the Old Testament, beginning from the time of Moses, about 1300 years before Jesus was born. Then we can look at the accounts of the Last Supper given in the Gospels. We can look at the theology of the Eucharist as it's given in St. John's Gospel. And we can see the changes which took place in the format of the Last Supper very soon after Jesus died. These are recorded in the letters of St. Paul and in one or two other documents from that time. Eventually, all of these sources led to the Eucharist as we celebrate it today, a reenactment of the Last Supper. There are 6 talks in this course, all of them are available on YouTube. So here's the first one. The Last Supper today, celebrating the gift of the Eucharist. In these talks, we shall be tracing the story of the Last Supper and the Eucharist as it is today, from its very first beginnings in the Old Testament, up until the time when the last developments are recorded in Scripture, mostly in the letters of St. Paul, though in some other places too. We shall be following all the developments that took place over that period of time, because firstly we need to understand what Jesus was doing at the Last Supper. He was fulfilling nearly 1,000 years of tradition that began right at the very beginning with Noah, through Moses and the liberation of the chosen people, through many other prophets, up until the time when Jesus lived and died. After that, we shall have a look at a small period of the history of the Last Supper. After Jesus' death and resurrection, they continued to celebrate this meal, but in a different way, much more often, and the service became much more simplified from the one that Jesus had been offering at the Last Supper. So we'll be covering a number of important themes in these talks. First of all, and most important of course, the Passover, that tremendous occasion when the Jews were freed from the Egyptians and which was commemorated every year with a great festival dinner, the Feast of Passover. It was a feast of thanksgiving for all that God had done for them. But during this Old Testament period, there were a number of covenants made between God and God's people. A covenant is a sort of legal promise where people on both sides give undertakings. Another theme that crops up here are offerings for sin. Both the priest and the people needed to make offerings for their sinfulness, and they needed to do it over and over again. But we shall also meet a very interesting person, usually referred to as the suffering servant. He was an innocent person who suffered. He suffered because of the faults of others, not for his own faults. But by his sufferings, he freed them from the consequences of their wrongdoing. We'll also have a look at something which is usually referred to now as friendship meals. These were meals not as formal as the Passover supper, but when friends get together or family get together, there are a few simple rituals which they always carry out. There's always, for example, the breaking of a piece of bread and sharing it among those present. It's a sign of unity and solidarity among the members of that family or group. Friendship meals. There's lots of examples of those in the Bible. And then, of course, the Last Supper itself. Actually, there's very little about it in Scripture. The accounts in the first 3 Gospels are very brief indeed, and in St. John's Gospel, the bit that we're really interested in, which was what Jesus said over the bread and wine, aren't mentioned there at all. John's teaching about the Eucharist is contained, as we shall see, in chapter 6. There, and in the words that he is recorded as saying at the Last Supper, we shall hear his doctrine of the real presence, of Jesus' continuing presence with us ever since then and throughout the rest of time. So we start by looking at covenants. It's a word still in use today. It means an agreement between 2 people which defines a relationship and a set of duties on either side. I will do this, you will do that. In the Bible, covenants are generally between God and God's people. Sometimes they're one-sided, where God makes all the promises. The New Covenant, as we shall see, is an important example of that. But mostly they are two-sided, and usually they're also conditional, that God will do something if the people will be faithful and keep his commandments. Frequently, of course, the people said they would, but then they didn't. Generally, that ended in trouble. It ended with them being invaded or by some terrible curse falling on them, and it wasn't until they repented and promised to follow God's promises that the calamity was lifted. So a covenant is a two-sided agreement between us and God. We're going to start with one particular covenant, a fairly ancient one in Scripture, the covenant with Noah. I'm sure you remember the story. There was a great flood. Noah decided to build an ark and put into it 2 of every creature. The animals went in 2 by 2. It had to be a fairly large ark to accommodate the elephants. Also, it must have been a tricky process catching 2 mosquitoes. And then the flood covers the whole of the known world, and Noah was alone at sea with all the animals and his wife and children. Eventually, he sends out a dove, but the dove just returns. Eventually, he did it once again, and this time the dove came back, but carrying leaves in its beak. So Noah knew that there were some trees poking above the water. The next time he sent the dove out, it never came back, and Noah knew that the flood was ended. God promises never to flood the world again, and God says that he will place a bow in the clouds as a sign. In this picture, you can see that bow in the clouds, the rainbow that we're fairly familiar with. In the foreground is Noah, slightly to left of centre. Beside him is an altar, a rather small one considering what it was needed for, and various other people are gathered around. Let's have a look more closely at the group of people in the centre. This is where God and Noah seal their covenant, their mutual promise together. Noah is the one there with the magnificent beard. To seal a covenant with God, several things are necessary. First of all, there is a sacrifice of a number of animals. To the left there, you can see someone bringing in a ram to be sacrificed. There's another one lying on the ground, having the blood taken from it. There has to be a burnt offering, and that's taking place on the altar in the centre. The animal carcasses will be burnt there to offer them to God. In reality, I presume it would have been a much bigger altar and a much bigger fire. And then there is the sealing of the covenant with blood. In the foreground you can see someone handing over a bowl which had been used for collecting the blood to be sprinkled on the people. A covenant was sealed by the shedding of blood. So this is a covenant between God and people, sealed with a burnt offering and with the sprinkling of blood on the people. Another important covenant, much more important really, is the covenant with Abraham. The Lord said to Abraham, that was how Abraham was first known, "Leave your country, your family and your father's house for the land I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name so famous that it will be used as a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who slight you. All the tribes of the earth shall bless themselves by you." Now Abraham, at the time of this, was very old, and his wife Sarah was very old too, well past childbearing age, so they are very unlikely to have a child. And yet God had promised that Abraham would be made into a great nation. Later on in the story, Abraham was asked to sacrifice the son that duly came along as an offering to God. Abraham realized that Isaac was his only chance of being the father of a great nation. Yet, because of his faith, he did what God had ordered. He believed that he would be the father of a great nation, even if he made that tremendous sacrifice of offering up his only son. God intervened at the last moment to prevent that sacrifice. But because of his tremendous faith in God, Abraham is still known as Abraham, our father in faith. But this covenant was made between God and Abraham. The Lord took Abraham outside and said, "Look up to heaven and count the stars if you can. Such will be your descendants," he told him. Abraham put his faith in the Lord, who counted this as making him justified. That day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham. "To your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river." It's an amazing promise from God, isn't it? Count the stars if you can. Such will be your descendants, he told him. This was the sacrifice of Abraham, our father in faith, and God's side of the bargain was to make the people very numerous and very strong. Abraham, our father in faith, because he believed in God, however unlikely it was that the promise would be fulfilled. We come now to the story of the Passover, the most central mystery, I think, in understanding the Last Supper. The story itself is fairly simple. Many years later, after the story we've just been looking at, the chosen people had gone to Egypt to buy bread. There was a famine in their country, but they knew that there was bread in Egypt. Another twist in the story was that they had arranged for their youngest brother, Joseph, to be taken away. They didn't like having him around. They didn't know that Joseph had gone to Egypt and risen to a very high and powerful position there. He was the one who could give permission for them to have corn, but they didn't know that. They became a threat to the people, all of these Jewish people who came there. They took over the land, became very powerful and very strong. and they were a threat to the Egyptians, who felt that one day they might take over the whole of the country. And so they enslaved them. They made them build the huge great storehouses where the corn would be kept. They restricted the number of males that there could be. And eventually the people began crying out under this oppression. And Moses was their leader, and he went to demand from the Pharaoh that his people should be let go, and Pharaoh predictably refused. Eventually, Moses led the people out into the desert on the pretext of offering a sacrifice. But the Egyptians realized what was happening and gave chase. So the chosen people were wandering through the desert, and they were being chased by Pharaoh's army on chariots. A little detail that was to become very important was that they were in such a hurry that they couldn't wait for the bread to rise, so they made bread without yeast, unleavened bread, and of course that is still of significance today. In fact, that unleavened bread became a symbol of the Lord's choice of his people. And throughout the centuries, it was going to be a key part of their celebration of that tremendous moment when God had shown how much he cared for his chosen people, when he saved them from the Egyptians. And this is how that happened. The Egyptians realized, of course, that the Israelites were trying to escape, and they chased after them with chariots and horses. But Moses opened a way through the sea, and they were able to cross over safely. The Egyptians saw this and decided to follow them. They made their way also through the sea, walls of water to right and left, it says in the Bible. But the Lord closed the water over them, and the entire Egyptian army were drowned. You can see in this picture the chosen people safely on the bank on the right, and the Egyptians drowning in the sea towards the left. I think Moses is that person more or less in the middle of the picture, slightly to the right, wearing a sort of bishop's outfit and hat. The Egyptians are quite close to land. That's really quite unrealistic, of course, but the artist had to get the Egyptians and the Israelites into one reasonably sized canvas. They could easily have reached shore in this picture, but in reality the crossing was quite long. But the people on the bank on the right, the chosen people, the Israelites, realized that they had been saved by God, that God had once again intervened to make them his chosen people. And so every year after that they celebrated this day, which is called the Passover. It was, if you like, the very first Last Supper. And keynotes of the Passover ritual, as it developed over the years, were a celebration of God's great love for God's people. They used unleavened bread as they had on that very first time when they escaped from Egypt. But it became a happy, family, cheerful celebration, until perhaps one day when the Lord would celebrate it, knowing that he was going to be led away to die. In the next tape we shall be having a look at how the Passover is celebrated still today amongst the Jewish community, and much later on in these talks at how it is celebrated today in Christian communities.